John D. Johnson is a research fellow in the Lubar Center for Public Policy Research and Civic Education. He joined the law school as a research associate in April 2016. Prior to Marquette, Johnson earned a bachelor's in history and political science from Western Illinois University and a master's in political science from the University of Illinois at Chicago. John collaborates with Professor Charles Franklin, who is also director of the Marquette Law School poll, on all of the law school's polling projects. In addition, his research interests include political and demographic trends in Wisconsin and the greater Milwaukee area. His work has been cited in national publications such as The Atlantic, NBC Latino, and the Associated Press, as well as numerous local publications, including the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel, Urban Milwaukee, WUWM, and Wisconsin Public Radio. Johnson's technical skills include R programming, data visualization, mapping, and interactive web application development. If there's time, maybe he can clue us in on some of those. He's got a Twitter handle. I've been following it. He does some very interesting studies on the side. So without further ado, I'd like to present John.
Hey everyone, thanks for that kind introduction, Alex. Let me get my screen share going. There we are. All right, thank you. Growing up in Macomb, Illinois, I benefited a lot from the local Rotary Club there, so it's really nice to reconnect with the one where I live now. Thanks for having me. Before diving into my presentation, I'd like to explain a little bit about my job first, as Alex asked me to. The bread and butter of my job is the Marquette Law Poll, but I also do quite a bit of work on political, demographic, and housing trends in Wisconsin generally, and the greater Milwaukee area specifically, and I'd be happy to talk about any of that, including the poll, after the presentation today. I've got some links on this first slides to places where you can find my work or get in touch with me. People are often a little confused when they hear about my job since its scope can seem quite broad. I think of our work at the Lubar Center as being primarily about trying to counteract the trend in this graph. Since 2004, we've lost about half of our country's print journalists, and the gap created by journalism's diminished capacity is being filled, I fear, on the one hand by professional PR agencies, and on the other hand by the paranoia and misinformation of social media. The Lubar Center, which I work for, is, among other things, an attempt to identify the facts we need in order to have a genuinely informed discussion about public policy in our region. The project I'm talking to you about today really began last fall when I helped my colleague Mike on an article he was writing for the Journal-Sentinel about the end of the residency requirement for city workers. As you may remember, the state legislature passed legislation in 2012 prohibiting municipalities from requiring their employees to live within their boundaries. Since then, 18% of general city employees and 47% of Milwaukee's sworn officers have either moved out of the city or never lived here to start with. As of mid-2019, about a quarter of MPS employees now live outside the district as well. Combining the city and MPS numbers and figuring an average household size of 2.4 individuals, that would translate to a loss of roughly 9,500 residents, which is about the population decline of Milwaukee over this decade. At the time, we wondered if the neighborhoods where lots of cops and firefighters used to live had also seen a big decline in homeownership. And what we found inspired our next article, the one I'm going to talk to you about today. Homeownership in the parts of Milwaukee where the most city workers used to live, think the far south and far southwest sides, hasn't actually changed very much. But homeownership has declined dramatically in other parts of the city in a pattern seemingly unrelated to the residency requirement. So for our next project, we measured changes in property ownership across Milwaukee's houses, that is single family homes, condominiums, duplexes, triplexes, and handful of 4-unit houses. We deliberately excluded apartment buildings from this analysis because we are looking at the kinds of homes that a family might conceivably buy to live in themselves. We also excluded city-owned properties and vacant land. So that left us with about 135,000 individual properties, which is 70% of the city's housing units. Before delving into the numbers, let me explain a little bit about how we conducted our analysis. Like much of what we do in the Lubar Center, it was a collaborative effort. Mike and I honed our research questions together. I did the data analysis, Mike wrote the first draft of the article, and then we worked together to polish the final product. All of our data in the piece is from the city assessor's master property file, which is a complete record of every parcel of land in the city. I combined the year-end files from 1990 through 2019. We determined if a property is owner-occupied or not by comparing the owner's mailing address with the address of the property. If the owner's mailing address is located at the house in question, we call it owner-occupied. If their address is somewhere else, we call it rented. Obviously, there are going to be some false positives and false negatives with this approach, but the statistics we generate this way track very closely with census estimates reached through a completely different methodology. Applying our methodology to each year's batch of data gave us the ability to take an unprecedentedly granular look at property ownership across the city. So to begin with, this graph shows just the total number of residential properties each year. As you can see, there hasn't been much change since 1990. As of the end of 2019, Milwaukee had about 88,000 single-family homes, 33,000 duplexes, 11,000 condos, and 3,000 triplexes. There has been a slight trend, the increase in the number of condos during the first decade of the 2000s. The number of condos doubled from 2000 to 2010, which won't surprise any of you who have driven around the city over the last few years. The number of single-family homes also increased really modestly over that period, and the number of duplexes and triplexes have seen a slow, steady decline in our data. Historically, Milwaukee has been a city of homeowners. From 1990 through 2005, a consistent 80-ish% of properties were occupied by their owner. Beginning in 2006, this changed. From 2006 to 2013, homeownership fell by about 1 percentage point of the total housing stock each year. Then the decline slowed, but still continued. In our data, 2019 is the first year to end with more owner-occupied properties than it began with since the Great Recession. Homeownership improved 0.4% over 2018. The decline in homeownership affected all housing types. Owner occupancy of single-family homes fell by 12 points. Duplexes also fell by 12. Now fewer than half of Milwaukee duplexes are owner-occupied. Triplexes fell by 10% and condos by 9%. Home ownership declines were severely concentrated in the north and west sides of the city. Home ownership fell by an average of 5.5% in majority white census tracts, 10.3% in majority Latino tracts, and 16.6% in majority Black census tracts. Another way of looking at this data that might be easier to understand is by aldermanic district. The districts covering the east side, downtown, southwest Milwaukee, and the far south side all declined by just about 5%. On the other hand, the first, second, and seventh districts all saw declines of 20 points or more. I was particularly struck by the trajectory of the second district here on the northwest side. In 2005, the second district had a higher owner occupancy rate than Bayview. Nearly 9 out of 10 houses were occupied by their owner. Now just 2 in 3 are. So all of this raises the obvious question, who owns these properties now? The answer in large part is landlords outside the city of Milwaukee. This graph shows the share of landlord-owned properties by the location of the landlord as measured by their mailing address. In 1990, 71% of landlord-owned properties were owned by someone with a Milwaukee address. By 2005, this had fallen to 63%, and in 2019, just half of Milwaukee's rental housing market was owned by someone in the city of Milwaukee. The decline from 1990 through 2005 was due nearly entirely to the growth of suburban landlords. They increased their holdings from 21% of Milwaukee's rented stock to 28%. Since 2005, Milwaukee landlords' share of the market has continued to decline, but suburban landlords are no longer the main reason. The big change was from out-of-state landlords. Their share of Milwaukee's rental market grew from just 5% to 14%. And keep in mind, the absolute size of the rental market grew considerably over this period. So another way of looking at it is the raw number of properties owned outside Milwaukee, which is what this graph shows. I've excluded financial institutions from these numbers, so it doesn't include properties which were foreclosed on and temporarily owned by Wells Fargo in Chicago or something like that. In 2005, the number of properties owned out of state was about 1,200. Now more than 5,600 are owned by a landlord outside of Wisconsin. In total, the share of all residential property value, homeowner or rental market owned outside of the city of Milwaukee has doubled from 7% in 2005 to 14% in 2019. The number owned outside of Metro Milwaukee entirely grew by nearly 6,000 since 2005. Especially large numbers of properties are now owned by landlords with Illinois, California, Texas, and to a lesser degree, Florida addresses. Since publishing our story in the Journal Sentinel, I've been trying to learn more about these out-of-state buyers, especially what their business model is. So I'm going to conclude by showing you a few of the things I've learned. This graph shows the number of transactions to an out-of-state buyer each year. I've excluded foreclosures and sales between out-of-state owners. So prior to the housing crisis, there were around 250 properties sold to someone in a different state each year. That increased dramatically during the Great Recession. The worst years for homeowners in Milwaukee were about 2010 to 2012. And during that period, we saw, as many as 900 or 1,000 or more properties being sold to an out-of-state landlord. What surprised me when I looked at these numbers the first time is that we didn't see much of a decline since then. There's been a pretty steady level of transactions to out-of-state owners, right around 800 or 900 a year throughout the duration of this decade. So to get a better sense of what was going on, I looked at the numbers this way. Each of these graphs shows the number of transactions to an out-of-state landlord broken down by the ownership of the property in the year prior to the sale. So there could have been an intermediate transaction like a foreclosure, but this is showing you who owned the property in the year before it was sold to the new landlord who lives in a different state. And this top left graph shows sales from Milwaukee owner-occupiers to out-of-state landlords. And what we see is that there was indeed this spike during the foreclosure crisis, and that it's fallen significantly since then. It's about halved from the worst of it, to where there are now about 300 sales from an owner-occupier to an out-of-state landlord each year. But sales from Milwaukee landlords to these out-of-state buyers have increased, making up the difference. So there's now about 300 sales from a Milwaukee landlord to an out-of-state landlord each year. We see the same trend to a lesser degree with suburban landlords. And then finally, there's quite a large market of sales between out-of-state landlords, as shown in this bottom left graph. Let me show you a map I made to explore this further. I'm going to have to reload it. Each dot on this map of Milwaukee is a house that is owned by someone in a different state. Let me show you what it looked like in 2005. So I showed you the numbers, but you can see the increase there as well. It's difficult to figure out exactly who these property buyers are for a couple reasons. One, the data inputted by the assessor's office is messy. You'd be amazed at how many different ways there are to spell the same name when you're going fast. And the second problem, the more serious problem, is that large buyers often hide behind multiple different LLCs. One thing my analysis has made clear, though, is that what's happening in Milwaukee is a little different than the national trend that I've read about. Since the housing crisis, there has been a national phenomenon of large investors buying up single-family homes. It's an entirely new market. According to Amherst Capital, prior to 2010, institutional landlords simply did not exist in the single-family rental market. Now there are 25 to 30 large national players. According to the New York Times, Blackstone, a major investment firm at its peak, owned 82,500 single-family homes. By 2016, private equity firms had acquired more than 200,000 homes in desirable cities and middle-class suburban neighborhoods. Importantly, though, this doesn't appear to be what happened in Milwaukee. These genuinely large-scale private equity investors wanted newish housing stock in cities with mild climates and hot rental markets. Milwaukee fails on all three criteria. In the absence of these large players, the out-of-state investor landlord model appears to have been adopted by an opaque circle of smaller investors. Let me show you a few examples of what I've found. So we can filter this map by the state of the landlord's residence. So these are all the properties owned by somebody who gets their property taxes sent to Texas. There's quite a cluster here in the Washington Park neighborhood. And what we see is that several names keep on repeating themselves. So this one is owned by SCV Ventures LLC, which is located in an office building on a freeway in Houston. This one is owned by the same LLC. So is this one. This one is owned by a different LLC, Milwaukee Capital Properties, but it has exactly the same address. We see the same names repeating all the way down this street. There are 3 LLCs from Houston which all appear to be connected: Milwaukee Capital Properties, and this SCV Ventures LLC. Collectively, they own about 124 houses, mostly single-family homes and duplexes in Milwaukee, particularly concentrated in the Washington Park neighborhood. A different model appears to be that used by a bunch of Illinois landlords. Illinois landlords own properties all over Milwaukee, but they're especially fond of, it seems, student housing in the UWM neighborhood, which is what we see here. So similar to the Washington Park situation, we see some of the same names repeating. Milwaukee Estates LLC, which is located in Chicago, WS18, located at exactly the same office building. But then we see a pretty common technique with these 3 duplexes located on North Downer Avenue between Linwood and Kenwood. So there's a duplex some of you may have passed before. It's located at 3060 to 62 North Downer Avenue, and it's owned by an LLC named 3060 to 62 North Downer LLC. The neighboring duplex occupies the address 3054 to 3056 North Downer Avenue, and it's owned by 3054 to 56 North Downer LLC. I think you can probably guess the ownership of the 3rd duplex on that street. Of course, all 3 of those duplexes list their ownership address as Unit 48 of 1030 North State Street. I looked that address up recently. It's a condo. That specific unit is for sale in Chicago, actually. It looks very nice. It costs about $900,000. I don't think that includes these 3 duplexes, but you know, it might be worth checking. So It seems like the landlords who are operating in Milwaukee, based on the research we've done and the conversations Mike and I have had, is not these large investors who there's been national reporting on. It seems to be that large investors have ignored the Milwaukee market because it's not profitable enough. But it is profitable enough to attract these smaller time investors who disguise their identity behind multiple limited liability corporations. Presumably, they're employing property management companies in Milwaukee to do the actual work of renting these things out. Looking to the future, I'm very concerned what the current recession we've just entered will do to the housing market. It may be that there will be even more foreclosures and even more distressed homeowners exiting the market, and who will be left to buy those properties. It might be more of the same thing that we've seen. I'm also working on getting access to eviction records to see, both in the recent past and moving throughout this year, if different kinds of landlords are more or less likely to evict their tenants based on, if they're a rental company that's based in the city of Milwaukee or the Milwaukee Metro versus if they're one of these out-of-state investors who may have never even set foot in Milwaukee when they bought these properties. I'd love to hear if any of you have any questions about this or any of the other work that I've done. Thanks for inviting me in to talk about this.
Thank you, John. That was fascinating, especially from my perspective. I'm kind of a data nerd, so I found it really interesting. I guess at this point, Michelle is going to convert our meeting into a joint meeting. I saw there's probably a dozen or so participants, and everybody who has a question is invited to pose that question on chat, and maybe we can run through that. I guess I'd start off by saying you mentioned that you live in Milwaukee yourself. Have you kind of skulked around the neighborhood to see if these out-of-state property owners take better or worse care of their houses than non-out-of-state people or people who own their houses?
Yeah, I mean, I would love to have more than anecdotal, data on that. I've been thinking about ways I might be able to do that, but it does seem like that's the case. There's a big difference between somebody who's renting out a house in the same neighborhood they live in, who has that vested interest in making sure that a certain standard is maintained, versus someone who's just looking to make money off of a property. I think that the thing that I'm worried is happening is that, so the ratio of rents you can charge to the value of a property is really weird in Milwaukee. People in data that I've looked at, people rent houses out in parts of Milwaukee where the entire value of the home is being recouped in like 3 or even 2 years. So I think one of the models people are using is renting out properties at a price where they're making a profit in just a handful of years, and they don't have a financial incentive to maintain the condition of the property. If it gets too many code violations, they'll just let it be foreclosed on and go back to the city after 7 or 8 years. They've already made their money.
I see we have a couple questions, so I'm going to recite those for everybody. From Mary Bolich, do people hide their ownership because it's illegal to own these properties, or what is the rationale?
In most cases, I think the rationale is, so one landlord explained to me that they do it so that if they're sued, only one pool of their assets is liable, because you would be suing the LLC that only owns 1 or 2 houses and not their entire operation. So that's one reason. Another is just to not be found, because sometimes it's embarrassing. So, I forget his name, there was an NBA player who owned a ton of properties in Milwaukee that were in really bad condition.
Well,
Yeah, and when it finally came out that he was the owner, that was pretty embarrassing. It doesn't look good to be a slumlord. So I think it's a combination of like tax purposes, liability purposes, and just sort of reputation.
next question from Lilith Fowler. It looked like the downward trend in Milwaukee ownership began in 2006 before the foreclosure crisis or the end of residency requirements. Any sense of what drove that?
Yeah, so to answer the second part of that first, I was unable to find any connection between the residency requirement and declining home ownership. The neighborhoods where the most city workers left are actually doing the best in terms of home ownership. They're still desirable places to live. The counterfactual, they would be doing even better if the residency requirement was still there and they hadn't lost a few thousand residents, but I haven't been able to find a causal link between that or even a correlation. I guess the decline in Milwaukee just started sooner than nationally. The Great Recession, of course, has this, distinct economic starting date in the first quarter of 2008 or the last quarter of 2017, I can't recall. But it seems clear that the housing crisis in Milwaukee, at least, started before that. So, and also when we talk about the national recession, I think that the technical end date for it is in 2010, but we see the negative consequences of it really peaking in like 2011 or 2012 here in Milwaukee. So the timing on a local level is a little different than the timing on a national level.
I was thinking way back to my banking days years ago. I will never forget there was a homeowner who complained that her actual value of her house had been declining, even though she's kept it up and made payments. So what was the incentive for her to keep it? And it's contrast that with like the last year or so where assessments in Milwaukee have been jumping significantly. So
yeah,
it kind of is a market timing thing almost.
Mm-hmm.
Aaron Szymanski suggests that the perception of hiding ownership might be multiple investors are owning a property as investments.
It's a really interesting question. I would love to know how many of these LLCs or sometimes there's one address that has lots of LLCs associated with it. And I would love to know if that's individual investors or investment groups behind it. I think that's a great question. I don't know the answer to.
From Chris Heinrichs, is this happening throughout the metro area? I have a friend in Brookfield in a really nice neighborhood who says a house on his block is one of a dozen picked up by the same buyer in 2008.
Oh, that's really interesting. I don't know. I should look and see. The data source I was able to use for this is this really excellent public records thing that the city of Milwaukee government has been doing for decades. And I need to look and see if the suburban governments do something similar. Some of them don't, I know, but some of them may. It would be interesting to look and see if the kinds of people who are purchasing properties in the suburbs in this manner are different than those working in the city, because the housing stock, of course, is quite different in places like Brookfield.
Is it your sense that out-of-state owners are a tick down from suburban owners? Because it seems like the ones we read about in the paper are all suburban owners and not so much out-of-state owners.
Yeah, I would love to do a kind of like causal test with, to see with maybe evictions, for example, if one is more likely to file than the other, but I don't have a clear sense of that.
Let's see, Mary's asking another question. Although it seems like it's not prohibited, is there any legislation being considered or proposed to regulate out-of-state or, non-owner ownership?
No. There is not. I think the place to start would be, and this goes beyond the housing market, legislation to require the actual ownership of things like LLCs to be transparent. I think that would be the place to start, is just to make it so that the actual literal person or group of people who owned properties are names that you can find rather than just lawyers' offices in some cases.
Do you have a sense of when neighborhoods might have a tipping point where um, enough non-owner occupied people own property that people just go, hey, it's the neighborhood of strangers, I'm getting out of here?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that's something we could probably look at.
Hmm. Well, I think that we've come to the end of our questions. I'll say last call for questions, but thank you so much for your time. It's been fascinating. Hope to have you again. I know you've done other studies on, I was commenting, you've done another study on uh, racial and ethnic composition of Milwaukee neighborhoods by neighborhood, and that would be another interesting subject to cover.
Yeah, if any of you have any questions about any of the other work we've done, please feel free to reach out. We try to be a very responsive and public-facing public policy institute at the law school. So